Good morning or good afternoon. We are here today to talk about preparing for your next website project. I chose this title screen here, this image, with the thought that this is indeed somewhat like thinking about preparing for painting. If you just slap the paint on the wall, it's not going to look nearly as good as it could. But if you carefully do a little bit of upfront work, so you think about your spackling and your priming and all of that stuff, then it makes the paint job way better. So you can think the same kind of way about preparing upfront for your website project. And welcome everybody as people are demonstrating in the chat. If you're just joining us, folks are putting in who they are, where they're from, and a little bit about what they're hoping to hear today. Fantastic. Great. So who am I? I am Laura S. Quinn. I am the editor of the nonprofit website Insider, which is a website and a twice a month newsletter about with website tips. And I work as a strategist, without a T, apparently, and a coach for people working on projects. So, for instance, I will work with folks who are thinking about their own, someone mentioned information architecture. So, thinking about their own information architecture, thinking about their own content, things like that. Or I will work with folks who are building a new site, either by themselves or with a website development firm. All right, so here's approximately what we're going to cover. So we're going to start with goals and audiences, always an important place to start. Aligning your stakeholders, thinking about time, money, scope, and polish. So this is slightly different than the triangle that is often talked about. Thinking about branding and quick hits, we'll define both of those. Deciding whether you should think about a website development firm for your particular project, or whether you can potentially go it alone. And if you do want to think about website development firms, thinking about firms and budgets and ways to find someone. All right. So you want to start with your goals. So think about what you're trying to achieve. Another very useful way to frame this is, what does success look like? At the end of your project, how will you know that the project went really well? What would that mean? And that's the type of thing that you can go around and ask stakeholders, various people in your organization to try to get a sense as to what they're hoping to get out of the project. You then want to try to avoid doing a project with 9 different high priority goals, simply because it's going to be very hard to achieve all of those goals. So you want to define maybe 1 to 3 North Star goals. So the goals that you are really aiming towards and that would really be failure if you don't achieve. Then you want to think about your audiences, or you could do it in the other order if you wanted. But thinking through all of the people who might use this project, so be the end users of your website, the piece that you're working on, if it's a piece, prioritize them. So again, you want to say, all right, here are my primary audiences, here are potentially secondary audiences. And it's very helpful, I find. This is something that's not talked about as much. It's very helpful to sketch out what the goals of your audiences are. So, what success might look like for them. So, in this case, like for instance, so it looks like we're looking at maybe a legal advocacy organization here. So your policymakers, so people who are in the legislature and you're going to be advocating to, have a altogether different set of goals than tenants facing eviction. So you could say, all right, well, we need to address both of these, but we're probably not going to address them in the same way. And so if you just proliferate, all right, we've got 8 different sets of audiences and all of their goals are very different, you're just going to set yourself up for failure. So you want to make sure that if you have a number of top priority audiences, that they overlap mostly in terms of what they're going to want. Or if they don't overlap, then you only have a small amount of audiences that you're trying to support. It's very important then that you think about your stakeholders. Who's on your stakeholder team? Who is making decisions on this project? Who is weighing in? I love this picture. Those of you who have been on other ones of my webinars have probably seen this picture before, because this is far too many people to be trying to make decisions. This might be like a steering committee or a kind of like a keep informed type committee. But it's so many people, and you got this woman over here who is like, what the heck is going on here? Um, so thinking through who can reasonably be involved, you want to ideally have a core decision-making group of probably ideally at least 2, maybe more like 3. You don't really want to be on your own doing it. But it probably doesn't want to be more than 5 or so, or things will just get really bogged down. You want to think about balancing your time, money, scope, and the polish of the site. So let me talk about what that means. So you may have more money than time. That would be a kind of unusual state for a nonprofit, but it is possible. Certainly, all of us are very busy. So if you do, in fact, have some money to spend, that would imply that perhaps putting money towards a consultant, for instance, might be helpful. Or do you have more staff time than money? So are you more able to put aside hours to work on this and do it yourself? If you do want to do it yourself, does your staff have the skills that you need? And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of whether you can do your project yourself, likely. If you don't have much of either, if you don't have much time or money, then you'll need to reduce the scope of what you're planning to do. So you can't just plan to say, I'm going to do this big, ambitious project, but I don't have either time or money. Um, because if you don't reduce the scope, what will instead get reduced for you is the polish. So this is sometimes talked about as the quality. So this is often things like graphic design or usability. So you'll get a less good site. And so there's almost never a good reason to choose getting a less good site. So you want to think about, do you in fact have enough money and or time to do what you're trying to do, or in fact reduce your ambitions? So while you are at the beginning of a project, especially if it's a full website build, it's often a good time to think about your branding. So to think about whether you're clearly presenting yourself to the world. So by branding, this is what I mean. So defining what you do, what your values are, what your key differentiation is. So this is kind of a big B branding as opposed to just kind of colors and logo and things like that. Those are also important, but I would say more important than that is defining kind of how you compare to other organizations that are kind of like you and making sure you're clearly presenting what is different about you to the world. So this is especially true if you're targeting folks other than clients. So things like people like donors, media, legislature. Um, this isn't cheap to do, however. So you can, there are some kind of do-it-yourself guides. It's kind of tricky to do internally unless you have a fair amount of experience, mostly because it's hard to see yourself from the inside. So it might be worth investing. You're probably talking about starting at a couple $1,000s for a project like this. The one we're looking at, so this was done by Constructive. This was probably a, I don't know, 20, 30, $40,000 project, including a bunch of user interviews, things like that. You might consider a quick hits phase. So, especially if you're doing a big project, it may take a while to actually get there. So, are there particular things that you want to do first instead of saying, all right, everything is dependent on getting to the end of this bigger project. So quick hits could be things like we're going to do a homepage makeover, or we're going to update the text on our donation page and our homepage to more effectively talk about ourselves. And we're going to take some pictures to put throughout the site. So things like that can be really valuable and can tide you over. But you should be careful that you don't derail yourself, that you don't, um, just get so involved in that particular project that you never actually do the bigger project that you may have the strategic goals around. So you can absolutely do them both at the same time if you can project manage them both. So, do you need a website firm? It is definitely more possible than it has been, a couple years ago to build something for yourself in a tool like Squarespace. So you don't need any specific skills to build in Squarespace. It will help with all of the things like thinking about graphic design, thinking about coding, thinking about making an accessible site. Um, oh, you do need the ability to be able to kind of map out what pages are the right pages for your organization. So that would mean either it's a very small site and there's only 5 pages in total, and it's pretty clear as to what they should be, or that it's if it's a bigger site, it's fairly clear how everything goes together, and you can, or you're really great at knowing how things go together, so you can build out, for instance, in this case, what goes under programs, what goes under volunteer, etc. What we're looking at here is the back end of Squarespace, which is very much so we're looking at an actual page. We've highlighted the text we want to update. You could, in fact, just type and update that. You could up just put in a quote. You could put in a button, a text. So all of that stuff is pretty intuitive to do to have things show up well on the site. It does, it's limited as to what specific features it will support when you get beyond kind of pages and things that might go on pages. Sorry, so like content, so like text and images and videos. So if, for instance, you want a complex event calendar that will filter down to only the events that are online or only the events that are about climate change. Um, it's not going to be so great for that. If you want a content library where you want, again, filtering, I'm using as an example. So if you have features that you don't see every day, if you want features you don't see every day, it's definitely worth asking. You're asking and looking at Squarespace to say, will it support this? And then you also want to think about, will you need more features eventually? So if you get up and running over, with a reasonable amount of work, like any site is going to take, I don't know, I'd say at least 8 hours to get up and put up a couple of pages. And paid and things with, 30, 40 pages could easily take 40 hours of work to put them up. So it's not going to just automatically move over into another platform. So if you're going to, you think in another year or two, grow to be a bigger organization, then you should think about another platform to begin with. The most obvious platform to be thinking about would be WordPress. Um, Also, Squarespace is not the only tool in this realm. There's Weebly. I don't like it as much, but it exists. It could have different features than Squarespace. It's not quite as easy to use in my mind. There's Weebly. Wix is one that's fairly well known. It's pretty comparable to Squarespace. It is for those of you that this is a concern, it is headquartered in Israel and has recently fired some of their staff that were posting pro-Palestine or pro-Gaza things. All right, so that is Squarespace, and the possibility of doing things yourself. So, if you are thinking that you might want to hire a firm or a consultant to do it, an obvious question would be, well, how much might it be? And this is actually a very hard question to answer because it depends a ton on who you hire. So starting at maybe even at like 5K to 10K for a freelancer who's going to kind of do everything themselves. The quality is going to vary a lot by the freelancer. So some of them could be great and some of them could be a total train wreck. And in fact, some of them could promise things and not deliver, and it's going to be, potentially bad news. So references and things like that are going to be really important here. Um, Always useful to work with a small firm because you've got more than one person to work with. So probably starting there at about 25K, maybe somewhat less. These are probably a little bit on the conservative side, that they're a little bit higher, just because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't underselling anything. 50,000 will get you a site with more complexity or with a larger firm. $100,000 will get you a straightforward site by a top firm. And this is why it's so hard to say how much things would cost, because you can in fact talk to a really high-end firm that does amazing work about your, 15-page site, and they will quote you $75,000 on it. You're paying there for a lot of help to think through exactly what you're doing and why and how, and graphic design and probably branding in that price point. Um, so things like that. Um, so let's see. You want to get logically approximate buy-in on your budget from your stakeholders. And it's really important. I'm going to talk about RFPs and RFIs, and I'm going to define RFI in just a second. That you don't put something out in the world without a price to try to determine what it might cost. Because the swing is this big, no one will know what site you want. And so you'll have the problem that you'll get some bids in at $10,000 and some bids in at $100,000, and it won't be clear what the difference is. So it makes much more sense to put out something that says, I've got $10,000. And there are people who will say, here's what I can do for $10,000. Bree, I see your question. I have just a few more slides. I'm going to come back around to it at the end. So let's talk a little bit about finding a web firm. So if you decide you want to. So if you have someone you like, don't feel like you need to look around. This is something that will drive web firms insane, is that you ask them for proposals, but in fact you had no intention of taking any of them to begin with. And it's a small world, so you may want to their goodwill later on. Other asking partner orgs for recommendations, membership organizations that you might be part of, people like that. Um, if you want to send out something to see who will respond, something like an RFI process, which I have a whole slide on, really improves the equity and efficiency over an RFP. So an RFP implies you're sending out a description of what you want, and you're asking people to send back how they would accomplish that and a price for it. A RFI is a request for a request for information. What you get back is information. So you send out a document that briefly describes the project. You gather answers. Sometimes the answers you want might actually fit into just like a Google form. So here's one that I did with a client. So we were looking at specifically, our budget was at $100,000 about. So we were asking how much work they do in that price range. How many times have they done this particular feature? About how many websites have you worked with that had integrated advocacy software, like so to allow constituents to email their local congressperson? And so this is something that you can then look at and you can just narrow it down. All right, these guys have never done any of this, and there's nothing else that is particularly compelling about them. We're just going to eliminate them. We don't even need to read anything from them. So we can create a shorter list. We can go look at websites and stuff like that. And then we can choose some list of like six, eight, maybe at most 10 to say, hey, we're really interested in what you do. Will you send me a proposal for this work saying precisely what you would do? And at that point, when they hear that they are in the top, whatever, eight, pretty much any firm will give you a proposal. The problem with doing an RFP and just sending it out into the world is there's a vast amount of firms. In fact, some of the best firms are the busiest, and will not respond. So the vast majority of firms will not respond to an RFP if you put it out. And many of the firms that won't respond are smaller firms, more likely to be owned by women or minorities. They're busy. They don't need necessarily the work. They don't need to chase work. Um, so this is just overall in my mind, and I help clients do this. It's just a better way to go. There's a bunch of stuff on my website, and I'll send out some links. There's a RFI template. There's a case study. There's more stuff. All right, and I'm going to pause on this screen to answer questions. We have officially 4 more minutes in our webinar. It's downside of doing a really short webinar like this. I will hang around and answer questions if you've got them. But you can also email me questions. Here's my email here. I do, in fact, answer the questions that people email me. Oh, and in fact, I have the wrong website here. If you go to this website, it will in fact redirect to my brand new website, which I'm really excited about, which is in fact nonprofitwebsiteinsider.com. I'll send that out in an email as well. So Brea, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asked, where might user research and AA accessibility go in that pricing? So AA accessibility is something that you would include in your write-up of your project. Oh, Gordon, thank you, Gordon. You would include in your write-up of your project that it's important to you. Um, Certainly at any kind of higher price point, most people will be including that already. So double A is sorry, for those who aren't familiar, there's a particular set of accessibility standards called WCAG, WCAG. And there's three levels. It goes up to triple A. Triple A is quite a adventure to try to get up to, but double A is actually fairly standard. So that would go. I don't think it's likely to increase the price in of itself, but it might increase the size of the firm that you need to go with or the experience level at the firm. So it might cut out the very lowest price points. For user research, so almost all firms are going to charge kind of I was going to say charge extra, but it would kind of be more of a charging like an a la carte menu for user research. You could also consider hiring a user research consultant to do it on the side, especially if you're looking at the lower end. Like very few people at the lower end of the price points will have experience to do user research. But you could hire in, truthfully, it's not that expensive to do. Well, user research, it implies two things to me, ideally on a project. So upfront interviews with users, that could actually get you probably, like at my rate, you'd be talking probably three, four, $5,000 for that upfront work. For user testing on like a prototype or something like that, so a set of things wired together, a set of graphic designs wired together, that's actually less expensive. So you're talking 1,000 or two for that. Um, so that's also the type of thing that, so user research especially, that I coach in, if that is of any interest. Natalia mentions, you mentioned that written branding is very important so that nonprofits can clearly present who they are via their website. Can you elaborate more on the importance of a nonprofit's visual identity, UI, UX, photography, logo choice, iconography, typography, etc.? I've heard of orgs paying little to no attention towards growing its brand visually, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Yes, absolutely. So written branding, very important. Not to say that the visual identity is not important. I would say that the visual identity is important. I would say more important than that is making sure that the website has a credibly good looking graphic design and a reasonable UI UX. So that is kind of the photography, typography, iconography, having things like um, clean choices for a page. There being white spaces. White space. There being reasons for like a visual hierarchy. So something like Squarespace can help you towards something like that, but you can in fact get into trouble when you don't do when you don't have any backgrounds there. So it's often the type of thing that a professional graphic designer can help you with. Um, yes, and I guess if you don't have a logo at all, a logo is absolutely an important thing to have. So thinking through how you are, showing up in all your collateral, and not just your website. Fantastic. Any last questions before I wrap up this super neutron star of information? I'm happy to keep answering them while you have them. Great. I will send out a recording and some related links for various things that may be of interest, certainly including the RFI. Actually, I have a webinar about credibility that I will send out. And absolutely, certainly consider signing up for the newsletter if you are not the Nonprofit Website Insider. And I hope to see you at another seminar soon.